Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll learn a defensive skill, and that is perpetual checks. Believe me, there are situations when you would be very happy to draw a game, when you cannot dream of winning a game. And in fact, it's quite important to realize when your attack runs out of steam and save the savable. We all had situations when we were over-optimistic or so excited about our own attack that forgot to at least save what still can be saved and pushed and was going for a win, going for a checkmate while it's not there. So for those situations, it's quite useful to have some patterns, some resources, some ideas at hand that can save you an important half a point. Because it's, of course, nicer to at least have a draw than to lose. So let's see some of those ideas. Here we are. In this position, it's clear that black has an extra rook, even though white has a pawn for it at the moment and could capture a second pawn. But nevertheless, not having a rook or having only 2 pawns for a rook is certainly not enough material compensation. However, in this particular case, white can force a draw by perpetual checks. Perpetual checks are a form of drawing a game due to the threefold repetition rule, which means is that if you have the very same position 3 times on the board with the same side on the move, before it arises the very 3rd time, you can claim a draw. So, what that means in this situation, white can start giving a check, so we are seeing this position for the first time in this game. Black has no choice but to move out of the check, and then the queen captures the pawn, reaching this position for the very first time. King moves back to g8, only move, and the white queen moves back to e8. Now remember, this is not the same position as we had in the beginning when black still had a pawn on h5. So this is the very first time. Black king moves out to h7, and now we're reaching the very same position a second time, which is the position with the white queen on h5 and the black king on h7. The black king has no choice but move back again. White should repeat the check again. And here we are. For the 3rd time, white has the option to move the queen to h5. And the way you claim a draw with repetition of moves, before you make your move for the 3rd time, you would write the move on your score sheet, and before actually making on the board the move, you would call a tournament director claiming a draw. Or you may tell your opponent that I'm claiming a draw based on repetition of 3 times. Chances are your opponent will acknowledge it and you don't need to call the tournament director over. But in case your opponent maybe doesn't know what that is or doesn't agree with that statement, then you would certainly want to stop the clocks and call the tournament director over to make sure you claim the draw. It's especially important in situations when your opponent may have other chances and may have a way of not repeating moves over and over. In this case, honestly speaking, it doesn't matter that much, because black has no choice. So even if you would repeat 4 times or 5 times, it's not much of a deal. However, if black kind of by mistake or not black necessarily, but the stronger side, mistakenly is repeating the same position 3 times, in those cases it's especially important that you claim the draw timely before your opponent finds the right way out. Let's see some more examples on similar ideas and different patterns. Let's see another example where the queen is the hero making the perpetual checks. Here we are. It's a very common, very typical idea. And oftentimes it would involve a sacrifice to get there. But in this case, it's just the raw version of it, the basic idea. And the idea is kind of similar to the previous position. The white queen would move to g6, not leaving black a choice, but to move out of the check. And then white would capture that pawn on h6. Again, the black king has no choice, and the white queen would move back and forth between h6 and g6 until you reach the very same position 3 times and claim a draw. Again, as you can notice, black had a clear material advantage, having still his own rook in addition to queen, and white only has a couple of pawns as compensation. So the only reason, the only way that white can save the game is by using this very important chess tactic, perpetual checks. Let's move on to the next example. When we're having new participants, we don't have a white queen to save the game, but white has a rook and a knight. Black's material advantage is quite obvious again, and white has to be very accurate in finding the right move. This is also a typical situation that I always remind my students of, that look for the best move of your opponent as well. White has a very tricky move here by moving the rook to d8 check. In this position, the black king can choose from 3 squares to get out of the check. 2 of them lose, and 1 of them wins. Quite a big difference. And if you're not attentive enough, or you're not searching for the best move of your opponent, you may forget that in addition to moving to f7 or moving to h7, which both would allow the fork with knight g5 and then winning the black queen, black can do better. Black can move the king to g7, and then after a second check, just keep the king moving up, carefully avoiding any forks. Black will be in a winning position, having material advantage. And that's why it's important to recognize always the best moves of your opponent as well. Once you do that, and you understand that rook d8 would be a cheap trick and will not work if your opponent finds the right move, you realize that you're better off save the game rather, if you can, than hope for a blunder on your opponent's side. And the way white can save the game here is by moving the knight to f6, give a check, and now black can either walk into a checkmate, which wouldn't be a wise idea, allowing rook to h7, or the king could go the other way, and in that case, white can force again draw by keep checking with the knight. And whether the king moves to e8, the knight moves back to f6, the king moves to f8, the knight moves back to h7, and goes back and forth until we would reach the same position a third time, which in fact we have just reached. And before making this move the third time, white already had the right to claim a draw. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. And this is another very important one. When we have the 2 rooks on the 7th rank, and the black king is on the 8th rank, which is in its typical place, that's where it starts the game, or that's where it remains even after castling. Here again, it's quite clear that black has a major material advantage. In fact, black is threatening to checkmate white in the very near future if the black rook would get the time to move to a1. But it's white's turn, and black will never get that time in this position because the white rooks will simply keep checking the black king along the 7th rank, and in this particular case, it doesn't even matter where the black king moves. The rook would just keep giving checks. Now, what is important on the other hand is that after the first rook check, we have to make sure that we don't touch the wrong rook, because giving the check with the rook from c7 would allow escape at the end of the day for black, and after all of these checks, the white rook could be captured. And black would give up his queen for 2 rooks, but maintain still a rook and pawn, which would give an easy win for black. So again, accuracy is always important, and if you already see a sure way to draw the game, don't risk anything. So if you noticed in the beginning of this position that if you just move the rook from d7, keep moving that just one rook, is a draw. Don't try to experiment moving your other rook. What's important here is that the rook on c7 does not let the black king walk through the c8 square and get to b8, in which case black would be winning because the b7 square would be controlled by the black queen. So again, remember this idea, the perpetual checks on the 7th rank. This is another very important example. White in this position is clearly ahead, having an extra rook and 2 pawns. Yet, black can save the game by giving a check on h2, forcing the white king into a discovery, which we learned about in some of the previous lessons. And here, the black bishop can pretty much move anywhere and give a check. And now white may block the check by playing bishop h5, but that wouldn't change any of the substance of the position. The black rook would simply capture the bishop. And if king g1, whether after giving the bishop up on h5 or without it, the black bishop would just keep coming back and forth to h2, and white could not avoid again drawing the game. And here we go. In this position, black again is ahead. Black has an extra piece. Even though a knight and bishop are about the same value, here black has 2 bishops. And also an extra pawn. Now this is a tricky position because some of you who are sharp tactically may think, oh, white can even win. Why should I settle for a draw? One idea to look at is to try to sacrifice your rook and then try to checkmate. However, it's very important, as I mentioned earlier, to always look out for the best responses of your opponent as well, not just of your own. And here, in that case, you'll notice that the black bishop is able to block the check on h6, and that, of course, would save black completely, and in fact, white just gave up a rook for a pawn for no reason. So, let's go back, understanding that we cannot win, and we are in a material disadvantage. A draw sounds like a good idea, but how can we achieve it? Well, in this case, we have to use a pin to achieve the perpetual checks. And indeed, white is able to give a check thanks to the pinned h7 pawn, leaving black only with one legal option, moving the king to g8, and then the knight is back on e7 again, and just keep going back and forth until you reach the same position 3 times, and then game over, you can claim a draw. Let's move on to the next example. Here we are. In this position, black's material advantage seems absolutely overwhelming. Black has his queen, and all white has an extra bishop, but black also has 2 extra pawns. And yet, amazingly, white can still save the game here. Try to sit back for a moment and figure out how. And here the solution is Not that difficult because white does not have that many options. So as I mentioned earlier, always be aware of the checks you can give. Because especially in hopeless situations, such as this one looks like, that's the only hope. Check. And just keep checking. And amazingly, but black has no escape. Blocking the check with the queen would of course turn around the material balance, but also it wouldn't even stop the same idea of repeating checks and ending the game in a draw. Although once black would give the queen up, would have no need to go for a draw already. But nevertheless, it wouldn't help black. And now let's see some examples from some real games that was played in the past. In this position, it was white's turn, and black's last move was to capture white's rook on f1. And this is quite an amazing example when knowing patterns, for example, such as we learned in the very previous position, can be very helpful. Because the most natural move when they capture your rook is to recapture. In this case, if the white king would capture the black rook at this moment, that would allow black to capture the bishop on e4, leaving black a piece ahead, and white's position would be quite hopeless. Amazingly, in this position, white can and should move the bishop simply out of the attack to f5. This would leave the black rook still under attack on f1. Now, if black ignores the threat to the rook, white will just capture the rook and do just fine. On the other hand, if the black rook wants to save itself and keep the material advantage, then white would be ready to draw in a very similar way as we saw in the last position, by keep giving bishop checks, and black has no legal move other than moving the king back and forth between h7 and g8, and the game is a draw. A very brilliant example. And let's move on to our next example. Here we go. This position is also taken from a real game where black has 2 extra pawns at the moment, which normally would give an easy win. However, white, with an elegant sacrifice, is able to force a draw again by perpetual checks. In order to achieve that, white needs to open the H file. And that's exactly what white can achieve finding the correct move here. I suggest you stop the recording for a moment and figure out a solution for yourself. And now that you came back, here is the correct solution. Knight g6, not leaving black any choice but to capture the knight. And now we created this common perpetual check pattern. Check, and again the king has only one choice, going back and forth to the H file and to G8. Once we reach this very same position the third time, white is ready to claim a draw and save the game. Let's move on. Here we are. This is another brilliancy. In this case, it's white who is ahead. White has 2 rooks and 7 pawns versus black's bishop and knight, which is clearly less than 2 rooks and only 6 pawns. So white has a very significant material advantage. In addition, the white queen seems to be in an attacking position, about to come to e6 and just kind of finish black off. However, black can be very resourceful here, amazingly, and save the game. This is one of the brilliances. Try to figure out how, with correct play, black can save this game. And amazingly here, black can and should sacrifice his queen just for one little pawn. And the amazing answer is queen h2. King takes queen and knight g4 check. Using the pin, using the fact that the white rook on g3 cannot move because it's pinned, and regardless whether the king goes to h3 or h1, knight takes f2, and the knight just keeps moving back and forth, checking the white king on g4 and f2, and white has no escape from the perpetual checks. Really amazing. What I'm trying to do in this lesson, give you various patterns, some of the most typical ones and some of the most beautiful ones, how you may be able to save a seamlessly hopeless game. And let's see one more example. Here we go, that has been also played in a real game. At this moment, black has an extra bishop, and it's one of those situations that white seem to have a strong attack. The black king is kind of in an open position, yet it's time to recognize that the attack is running out of steam. And that means a draw would be a great result, considering the material advantage that black has. In this case, that correct move is to sacrifice our rook and to open the 5th rank. You'll see in a second why this is so important. Blocking the check at the moment would be kind of suicidal because that would allow checkmate by queen d5. But what happens after pawn takes rook? Well then, queen g5, and after bishop g6, and this is the important element, the black pawn is no longer on f5, therefore the white queen is free to go to d5, forcing the black bishop back to block the check, and the queen will simply move back and forth, checking the king between d5 and g5, and the game again is a draw. And finally, again, still on the same theme, but I'd like to show you the jewel of the week. This is really amazing. Here we go. In this position, black has all his pieces on the board. I have to admit that this is not a common position and you most likely will never face this position in your game. However, it's the ultimate example on showing what a perpetual check is about. It's obvious that black's material advantage is overwhelming, so a draw would be a great result unless we could checkmate, which white is not able to in this case. And here comes the dance of the knights. Knight f5, check. Black has only one choice, moving to d7. Knight e5, king c8. Knight e7 using the pin. King b8. Knight d7 check. King a7. Knight c8. King a6. Knight b8. Again, the black king has only one choice. Knight a7. King b4, again only choice. Knight a6. King c3. Knight b5. Again, only choice. Knight b4. As you can see, black keeps having only choices. King e2, knight c3. Now black here has a suicidal choice by moving the king to e1 because that would result in a checkmate. So of course, black is better off avoiding that and rather move the king to f2, and then the checks continue. King g3, knight e4, king g4, knight e5, king f5, knight g3. Again, only move, knight g4, and we are back where we started. Isn't that amazing? So once we make this circle 3 times around, or at least the first situation, the first position that we have the 3rd time around, we can claim a draw. Quite amazing, isn't it? Well, I hope you had fun, and I hope you can use some of these ideas to save some seemingly lost games. Good luck with it, and until next week. Bye-bye.